Hi, I'm Dan McCollum, and I'm going to start with an apology of this is incredibly depressing. I'm not going to pretend that it's anything other than that. I'm going to present a lot of problems with very few solutions, and it is too early for this. So drink some coffee, shed some tears, and let's see if we get through this. So I've got no conflicts of interest at all. So let's start with the case. And this is something that you've probably seen a lot of. You start a shift, you actually have multiple patients that have been comatose, all in the same shift. You had to give Narcan to basically bring them back. Increasing number of your patients are actually demanding opioids, saying, hey, I've got an ankle sprain, I need some Percocets for that. You've also got an increasing number of patients presenting asking for rehab. And honestly, with opiates in particular, we don't have the beds for it. Even people that can pay for rehab often have a hard time getting help with opioids, and so many of our patients don't have any coverage. How did we get here? What's the history behind this? Why are we stuck in this situation? So I'm going to give a historical overview of what that is, and then give a few ideas of how we can kind of make this a little bit less of a terrible situation. So first of all is a paper called Porter and Jick, okay? This is not much of a paper because this is the entire paper, okay? I'm not going to read it to you because you're adults, but this is the paper, and it's basically a letter to the editor, and this is how we got into all this trouble. Basically, they did a chart review on thousands of patients, and the only way that you'll be flagged as being addicted to opiates is if someone actually basically did an ICD code saying you're addicted to opiates. These were also inpatients. So every patient that came in had appendicitis or whatever, you gave them some morphine. If they got opiates and then no one said, hey, you're addicted to opiates before you left, they said, they're probably not addicted to opiates. Obviously, this is ridiculous, but they gave us so little information, I can't even critique this article because they didn't describe their methods. This is not science, this is just some random letter. Somehow, despite this terrible paper that has nothing to do with anything, because we all know that there are folks that come into the ED that are clearly addicted to opiates, and they don't actually get a diagnosis of opioid addiction because we didn't actually take the steps to make that diagnosis. It's ridiculous that you would say in this no long-term follow-up cohort of folks that got discharged from the hospital that this tells us virtually nothing. However, this paper causes a lot of problems. So next up, you might have heard of something called Oxycontin or Percocet or any of the other cousins of the oxycodone family, the hillbilly heroin. So Purdue Pharma had a problem, and that problem was that they had a patent that was running out. That was MS Contin, a very successful drug. The problem was when that patent ran out, they didn't have a whole lot of other meds in the pipeline. So they released Oxycontin, and its claim to fame was that this is extended relief, okay? As opposed to other pain meds that you'd have to take multiple times a day, because heaven forbid you have to take acetaminophen every 6 hours. How could you do that? This was something that you could take twice a day. And they knew that this was something unique to their drug in the opioid market, because they didn't have a lot of long-acting, opioids. So they marketed it as extended release. The problem with that is it doesn't work as an extended release drug. It actually wears off after about 6 hours. So here's the problem. On their FDA marketing label, their indications for it, you shouldn't take Oxycontin more than twice a day. So if you weren't getting relief with 15 milligrams of Oxycontin twice a day, you still had back pain or whatever, what you would do is you're supposed to increase the dose as opposed to increase the frequency. However, their own marketing data and studies that they have shows that this lasts for about 6 hours. So no matter how good the pain control was, and many patients actually had acceptable pain control early on, you guys have seen this again and again. Oh, that Percocet works great, but then it wears off, and then 7 hours later, I'm actually in pain. That's not them lying to you. That's just them being honest with how pain works. The meds wore off, their pain came back, and the solution, per Purdue, was to increase the dose as opposed to increasing the frequency, because it wasn't FDA approved for that, and that would ruin their marketing campaign. So there's a problem with 6 hours, which is how long it actually works, versus 12 hours, what it was marketing as. And so that's how you ended up with folks that honestly didn't have that bad of pain to begin with, but end up on 100 milligram tablets of Oxycontin. It's because of that disconnect between how the drug actually works and how we were told that it would work. So obviously the oversight was excellent because the head of the FDA that approved Oxycontin was actually hired by Purdue within 2 years. This is really a great situation and altogether too uncommon in a lot of the federal agencies that actually regulate these folks. So honestly, I can't even be mad at these guys. Like, well done, guys. And they were wildly successful with it. They spent $200 million just promoting this drug in 1 year. And those promotions took all forms. There was direct-to-consumer ads. There was a lot of stuff actually focused on physicians because at this point, doctors were not comfortable with the idea of long-term opioids. They said, we got this one letter to the journal, but that's all that we have to go on. There's no long-term follow-up on these folks. What are you talking about? So the sales reps kept citing Porter and Jick as a study and said, hey, in this study, there was less than 1% addiction, which honestly told us nothing. They didn't follow these folks. They don't know what happened to them later. And so they kept hammering that home. Your risk of addiction is less than 1%. That was a commonly cited percent. And because of that, people lowered their threshold of what justified opioids. So instead of saying, hey, you broke your arm, this is very reasonable for a few days, sprained ankles started getting it. Routine back pain started getting it. We started seeing a lot more of that. As part of their court cases that came out later, there was a lot of stuff that had to be revealed that honestly Purdue did not want revealed, such as this memo of its bonus time in the neighborhood, where they actually got bonuses depending on how many pills they sold to doctors, and especially if it was the higher concentrations. So you'd actually make more money if you sold the 100 milligram tablets as opposed to the 15 milligram tablets. That's why so many of those tablets actually started moving. They also, unbelievably, actually distributed free coupons. I can't believe this, but it was actually something they did. They were handing out samples of these drugs. So the government realized through patient advocacy groups that pain was not adequately being treated. And honestly, the patients were right about this. We weren't doing a good enough job of using multimodal therapies. We weren't getting people into physical therapy. We weren't following them up for chronic pain. We weren't treating mental illness that was contributing and worsening a lot of people's chronic pain at all. So that depression that was making your back pain worse, it was getting worse. So there was a lot of problems as far as people having pain. It wasn't being treated, and that led to the pain becoming the fifth vital sign. So there's a problem that was being documented of what do we do with these folks? How do we get them taken care of? And this was a paper by Portnoy, Chronic Use of Opioids and Non-Malignant Pain, report of 30-something cases, okay? The problem with this was they only took a few dozen folks, okay? And they basically said, these folks aren't getting addicted. They didn't have cancer, and we gave them opioids. To this point, the only folks that were really getting chronic long-term use of opioids were cancer patients. So with 38 patients, they didn't have any problems, which to me is a big whoop-de-doo, okay? There's obvious selection bias because these weren't the first 38 people they saw. These were 38 selected patients that they chose to put on chronic opioid therapy, and they didn't really have any trouble. Obviously, there's huge problems with this because you have to stop at a certain point following these folks, and you only have 38 patients. So with only 38, does that justify putting millions of Americans on opioids every day? Absolutely not. But this was the paper that said, hey, it's not just for cancer anymore, we can move forward. So it started with Porter and Jick, then moved to Portnoy. Since then, much to his credit, the author of that paper has actually asked for forgiveness. He's actually one of the biggest advocates to restrict the use of opioids and to treat pain in other methods. So I actually have a lot of respect for that author for doing that. So then, of course, JCAHO comes along, which is always the thing that you want to hear in a hospital. Here comes JCAHO. And they advocated for pain being the fifth vital sign, okay? Now, their intentions may have actually been pretty good here because pain wasn't adequately being treated. However, when you start calling it a vital sign and you actually ask someone, hey, what's your pain from 1 to 10? The patient has an understandable expectation that you're going to do something about it when they say 10, okay? Which honestly is at the low end of our scale because I think it starts at 10 and goes to 20. So there's a real problem with if you say you've got 10 out of 10 pain and we say, okay, that's nice. That's like saying that you have a heart rate of 140. Okay, that's nice because they made it a vital sign. So this actually started in the VA system where it got traction and then expanded to civilian hospitals from there. So the opioid makers were actually part of the group funding this because they were actually funding those patient advocacy groups. The patients themselves didn't have much money. The drug companies got buckets of money. They basically gave it to the advocacy groups that sort of more or less laundered that money into making it seem like it was coming from the patients when it was really the drug companies that were making the money off of this. So they were actually the ones indirectly behind this pain as the fifth vital sign. After this happens, after pain becomes the fifth vital sign, we have a quadrupling of the number of deaths in the next 10 years. This is crazy. In 10 years, we should have seen this coming. And what did we do? We actually doubled down. We actually got worse. So the number of prescriptions increased by 700% in the 10 years, roughly around there. This is a slide from Ruben Strayer, an excellent speaker on this very topic of opioids and how we got into this mess. So you see a skyrocketing of abuse. You see a skyrocketing in the number of scripts. The more scripts there are, the more people are addicted. There's a direct correlation with that. And it's a part of the history. This is not a vital sign. I don't have a painometer that I can objectively read in the same way that I can read a heart rate. So this is a subjective bit of history. We all know that there are plenty of folks that break their femur and they say a 6 out of 10 as they're crying because they're actually using the pain scale appropriately. We also know folks that get a paper cut and they say that it's a 12 out of 10. So this pain as a fifth vital sign is problematic from the beginning because it's not vital and it's not a sign. It's part of your history. So what happens? Well, drug mills start up. And so drug mills were basically pain clinics that didn't really follow what they were supposed to do, and they just handed out lots and lots of pills. So this is a population in the U.S. compared to the rest of the world, okay? We're not that big. This is our opiate use. So we're dwarfing the rest of the world combined. So despite the fact that we have more or less 5% of the world's population, we're using the majority of the world's opiates. So this is why when you read literature from Europe, when you read literature from Australia and so forth, they're slowly becoming more like us, where they're using more and more opiates. We're still leading the pack. Yeah. And we're going to continue doing that for a while. But talk to somebody from Canada, and you'll see that they're doing the same stuff that we did 10 years ago. They're doing it now. So this is the national overdose death rate, okay? And it's slowly going up, okay? Steadily. And these are the years that came after pain was the fifth vital sign. So then we started saying, look, we can't have these pill mills, okay? And there were actually a lot of folks that were driving down to Florida. They would get several hundred Percocets and they would drive back up and sell them, okay? So we actually had a reaction against them, and the authorities appropriately shut down the most egregious offenders. Some of these places still continue a little bit, but they have to operate a little bit more discreetly now, okay? So there's actually an excellent description of this. There's a book called American Pain that discusses a string of these places in Florida and how they got shut down. Fascinating, but I don't have long enough to discuss it. So what happened? We actually see a dip in the amount of oxycodone that gets prescribed, okay? See that little tail end there? And I want you to remember 2011, okay? Keep that in your mind, 2011, all right? Because we actually started prescribing less, right? We've won, right? That's great news, right? I've been railing against it. And then the authorities say, hey, Purdue, you got to pay $600 million because of some of the stuff that you marketed. That's it's bonus time in the neighborhood. That stuff came out, kind of embarrassing. They had to pay $600 million for the stuff that they did. Problem with that $600 million fine is they had revenues of over $30 billion that year, okay? So it's kind of like giving Bill Gates a speeding ticket of $500. Might hurt me, he doesn't notice, okay? So the $600 million fine, while impressive, not much if you got revenues of $30 billion. So how did we get to heroin and fentanyl? You just said oxycodone dropped off. What happened? Well, if you'd like some more information about this story, because I only have a half hour, Dreamland, a book by Sam Quinones, is actually an excellent discussion of this very problem. Look at the national overdose deaths due to heroin, okay? They spiked. And what year did they spike? 2011. So did we actually fix our problem? No, we just swapped it over. We sold fewer Percocet, and what did they do? They initially started trying to buy pills on the street, and that supply dried up when we closed down the drug mills. So what did they do? They turned to heroin. 4 out of 5 heroin users started on prescription pills. Very few people now just start with a needle in their arm. They got there. And many of those folks that got there through reasonable ways. They had a shoulder surgery and they had to have some Percocet to initially recover. Not necessarily wrong, but no one pulled them off that Percocet. So as opposed to recovering for a few weeks, they just kept going and going. After a while, they tried to taper it off. The pill mills shut down. Doctors realized the problems with Oxycontin. We tried to get them off, and they turned to heroin because they had to support their addiction. So this is actually causing a drop in the life expectancy. This was one of the first years recently that we actually had a drop in the life expectancy in America. And the leading contender for why that happened was actually drug abuse. So opioids are responsible for 1 in 8 deaths of Americans between 25 and 34. This is another slide from Strayer. It's depressing that this is so high, that especially for younger folks. So if you remember history, Prohibition, before Prohibition happened, there were a lot of beer drinkers in America, okay? Because beer is delicious and proof that God loves you. However, as soon as Prohibition came about, all the breweries shut down. And what do they start drinking? Liquor, which is also delicious, but for different reasons. So liquor shows up. And why? Because it's really difficult to transport beer. You want to concentrate it as much as possible, right? If you're going to be a rum runner, you're not going to do it with Coors Light, okay? You're going to do it with the most high-grade stuff that you could. And so Americans learned to like liquor because we made liquor illegal. And that's exactly what happened with opiates. So imagine that you're a street dealer and you're trying to smuggle things across the country, okay? You want as much as you can pack in per kilogram to make money. So if you're trying to get marijuana over here, you'd make about $5,000 if you had a kilogram of marijuana, which is actually a little bit of a ludicrous amount of marijuana. It's like a backpack full. It's kind of silly because marijuana doesn't weigh that much, okay? But you'd only make about $5,000 from it because pot's cheap, okay? It's not something that you smuggle. You don't hear, oh, we busted Colombian drug lords because they had a plane load of marijuana. They're generally not doing that anymore, okay? Especially with Colorado and California. So you say, okay, cocaine, why not? You make about $15,000 per kilo. Makes sense. A lot better value. And that's why the cocaine folks were so popular. Oh, heroin. Well, it turns out if you haven't stepped on it yet, you haven't diluted it down by putting in other stuff, heroin's really valuable. It's worth over $100,000, about $130,000 if you had pure heroin, okay? This is why it's so popular. You can actually take a little bit of heroin, you can spread it out. It's often diluted by a factor of 10 by the time it actually gets to the actual user on the street. And so you can make a lot of money if you actually have access to pure heroin. Fentanyl makes this look comedic. This is $1.3 million per kilogram of fentanyl, okay? Now you might say, wow, I bet fentanyl's really, really expensive to make because look at this profit thing. The marijuana actually disappears. You're like, why on earth would anyone be a pot dealer anymore? Well, it only takes about $1,000 of chemicals to make $1 million worth of fentanyl. And where is this coming from? Mostly from China right now. They're trying to actually clamp down on this, but it's a problem because whenever you got 1,000 to 1 profit margin, stuff's going to be missed. And it's comedic, the idea that they're going to catch this. They had a hard time stopping people with cocaine, and I just showed you how expensive it was per kilogram. This is a factor of 1,000 more than that. So do you really think they're going to stop someone with a brick-sized shape of something in their luggage? Not a chance. And if it's only $1,000 to make it, why would you bother? So it's really, really hard to stop this at the borders. A book on this would be Narconomics if you'd like to learn more about it. So the aftermath, where are we with this? So approximately 30,000 die due to opioids every year in the United States. And this is sobering because this didn't used to be the case. We had prior drug epidemics before. This is not our first one. You see heroin drawn in the box in the 70s. And people were talking about heroin like it was the worst thing ever when it first came out. There actually wasn't much of a change in overdose deaths. The cocaine epidemic that some folks might have actually practiced through. And remember when crack cocaine first hit and how many people that hit. We didn't see a huge spike in mortality. Look at what happened now. And this unfortunately stops in 2008, right? So it keeps going higher and higher. We actually don't know how many people died the last year or two because they're still counting. But the deaths keep going up. Now we're actually seeing more people die due to overdose than due to car crashes, which is sobering because think of how many people you've seen that got into car crashes. These are deaths per year. In 2013, the most recent year that we had data, this is killing more than AIDS. This is killing more than murder. And overdoses continue to rise. This is not going to get better before it gets worse. The sad thing is, I've just been presenting mortality data, and I think that's only a small part of the story because it's very easy to count dead bodies, right? You can point at the body bag and say, that one died, that one died. I think the real tragedy to this is actually how many people don't die and all the people that love that person, okay? So for every one person that you got that actually dies, you're going to have 10 people that have to go to treatment. You're going to have 30 emergency department visits, and that number actually seems low to me. And then you're also going to have over 100 people that abuse, okay? And then over 800 people that are using it non-medically, which there's a big overlap between the abuse, the chronic users, versus the people that are just using it recreationally. And it's becoming more and more common, okay? This also doesn't count for all the people that love these folks, right? Because on top of the folks that are actually suffering, you've also got the loved ones. How many times have you had a parent bring in a young person that's abusing heroin, and it's the parent that's really the patient in front of you because the kid doesn't want help, but the parent does. So these numbers do not actually adequately track all the problems that we're seeing here. So what happened to Purdue Pharma after all this? Well, this is the Sackler family. And so, of course, they were imprisoned because of all the stuff that, no, I'm just kidding. They weren't at all. They're actually worth $14 billion, and they're one of the richest families in the country. So it's not going to change. Now they're actually keep advocating their abuse deterrent methods. So they're actually clamping down on the generics that are daring to make Oxycontin for folks for cheaper. And so they're actually actively campaigning to reduce the availability of the non-generic formulations of their drugs. So they've had things such as if you try to crush it up and snort it, it turns into jelly because of a gum-like substance that they have in their patented pill form. They call them gummy noses because if you try to snort it, it won't work. The problem is Drug companies want to make money. Addicts want to get high. They have more time than you do. Anything that you do to make it abuse deterrent will fail, okay? No matter what you do. This is like trying to protect your computer from viruses. Eventually, if someone wants in your computer, they're gonna get there, okay? You can try to protect yourself as much as possible, but addicts are gonna figure out a way around every single one of these deterrent things. It just isn't gonna happen. The only way that we can actually address this is to actually get appropriate treatment for them and limit the supply. So I encourage you to follow the CDC Opioid Guideline. You should very rarely be using more than 3 days of opiates for acute pain. Almost all of them should be less than 7 days, which is what I'm usually giving for things like fractures. And you should almost never use it for chronic pain. If they don't have cancer, if they don't have sickle cell disease, you are not operating an evidence-based method if you're giving them opiates. There's no data for it. Stop it. Also, please stop using codeine, tramadol, and Demerol. There's a lot of use of this. These drugs preferentially go to the folks that you're worried about. You're not giving them the real pain pills. I really encourage you to have that heart-to-heart conversation with them of, look, I don't think opioids are appropriate for your complaint, and use other methods such as NSAIDs or acetaminophen. Naloxone, the game has also changed because of the stuff we're seeing on the street. Used to work really well for just regular old heroin. Now we got a problem because fentanyl and carfentanil and pink and U-470, all those things require a lot higher doses, okay? So what I do is I actually start lower than what I used to, okay? So I often give 0.1 milligrams. Some people actually advocate for 0.04 milligrams, which I just find annoying to draw up. Start low, because if you've ever given too much Narcan and someone comes up swinging or actively vomits on you, you'll realize your mistake. So start low, see what they do, and then don't forget that you actually have to go very high with some of these new, more potent opioids. Don't stop until you hit the double digits, okay? So go from 0.1 to start with, see what they do. If they're not actively dying in front of you, you've got a few minutes to figure out how much to give them. And then if you really believe this is an opioid intoxication and they're comatose, keep redosing until you hit 10 milligrams, because these new drugs are so potent that some folks are actually requiring much, much higher doses than we're used to. Also, always discharge these patients with a script for naloxone of some form. The intranasal is the cheapest where I live, but look at what you got. The injectable kits often cost a few $100. A heroin addict will never fill that script. Give that script to their parents because they can fill it. There's quite a few parents that will fill that script because it's something that could save their kid's life. And refer all folks for help. I know that this is tough, and I know that there's not enough facilities out there for this, but make sure that you're at least having a quick check-in with these folks that come in. Are you interested in getting help at all for this? Because you could have died today. It's amazing that we give them the Narcan. We saw them in a comatose state. They often wake up and don't know how close they were to death. That if there wasn't a really good paramedic that took care of them, they would have died today. So we need to have that close conversation with them and actually discuss with them, how are we going to get you taken care of in the future? Do you have any questions?